Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Lord of the White Hell, Book 1, by Ginn Hale. Narrated by Jakobi Diem. Chapter 1. Kiram woke as the carriage jolted against the rough cobblestones of the country road. After 6 days of sleepless travel, he couldn't believe that he had dozed off today of all days. He frowned at the creased front of his white linen shirt and tucked the loose edge back into his dark pants. His curly blonde hair was always a wild mess after he had slept on it. He tried to smooth it with his hand, feeling the tight spirals spring back as his fingers brushed over them. His book, Modern Mechanism, lay on the carriage floor. Dozens of strips of paper protruded from between the pages, displaying Kiram's notes and diagrams. He retrieved the book, straightened his notes, and carefully wrapped the book in the remains of his parchment and tucked it into the wide pocket of his new Cadeleonian wool coat. Kiram had packed very little clothing and only a few of his favorite books. Tools and crated machine parts filled most of the space in the carriage. Many heavier crates groaned against the rope securing them to the roof of the carriage. The driver had charged Kiram's mother twice the normal fare because of the weight, but she had been proud to pay it. Those heavy, oily pieces of metal had won Kiram the right to attend Academy Sagrada. No full-blooded Haldiim had ever before been accepted into the school, and a century had passed since the half-blood Yasin Lif Harun studied there. Lif Harun's formulas had altered the very heavens. A statue of the man stood in the royal park. Kiram's father had already pointed out the spot where he thought Kiram's own statue would one day stand. If his parents had been allowed to, they would have sent another half-dozen carriages filled with praise dancers and red-dyed doves to announce their youngest son's arrival. Fortunately, the school permitted only one carriage per student. The carriage struck another bump, and Kiram shoved the stack of rocking crates back against the carriage wall. Sunlight streamed in through the red carriage curtains, filling the space with a warm glow. The dark wood radiated a late afternoon heat. The brown coat he'd worn for the trip over the mountains felt sweltering hot now, and smelled of his sweat. Kiram stripped it off and stretched his long legs as best he could in the cramped confines. He couldn't be far from the Academy Sagrada now. Maybe an hour, possibly less. He pulled the curtains aside and gazed out at the walls of wild green forest that arched over the road. There was a flash of brilliant blue wings as a flock of jays took flight from the overhanging branches. He thought he caught a glimpse of something white moving fast between the trunks of trees, but he lost sight of it as the road turned away. As he rode further, the dense brambles and towering oak trees gave way to groomed hedges and open fields divided by low stone walls. A flock of white ducks waddled along the roadside, tended by a young, bored-looking boy. Far across a fallow field, Kiram spied a horse and rider. The horse was brilliant white in the bright sun, and the rider's skin seemed almost as pale as the horse's hide. His black hair stood out in sharp contrast, as did his deep blue Academy Sagrada uniform. Kiram doubted that his own uniform, well made as it was, would look so good on him. He wondered if the rider was an upperclassman or even an instructor. Kiram stared in amazement as the lean man urged his horse ahead, and the two of them seemed to fly over the stone wall, then raced across the road and through the opposite field. He didn't spare a glance for Kiram's carriage, the herder boy, or even the flock of now startled ducks. A few moments later, both the horse and rider were little more than a distant haze. Kiram tried to keep track of the rider's blue jacket, but eventually he lost sight of it amongst the fields of blooming sunflowers. Kiram felt his pulse surging through his body. This was exactly what the Academy promised for his future. Such fearless prowess, such determination and beauty. Perhaps even adventure. Kiram had been patient for days, but suddenly he felt as though this slow, creaking carriage would never reach its destination, and he needed to be at the Academy now. Desire and excitement coursed through him like a physical pang. As the carriage rolled up to the heavy stone walls that surrounded the Academy, Kiram gripped the latch of the carriage door. He hardly took in the fortress-like towers of the main building or the chapel's brilliant blue spire. He stared at cobblestone paths and green lawn of the grounds, searching for his fellow classmates. Several boys dressed in academy blue strolled toward the chapel, but none of them captured Kiram's attention the way that single rider had. The carriage jerked to a halt, and Kiram slipped slightly forward, his hand pulling the door latch. Instantly the carriage doors sprang open, and he spilled out onto the muddy ground in front of the stable. He struggled up to his feet to see two older men in gray scholar's robes gaping at him. Just behind them, leading his brilliant white horse by its reins, stood the rider. "I'm fine," Kiram announced, though no one had asked. The door opened and I wasn't looking." Kiram could feel his face flushing bright red. Not even his dark skin could hide such an intense blush. He regained his feet quickly, but to his horror, the rider's expression shifted from slight concern to amusement. His handsome smile somehow made Kiram's humiliation far worse. He glared at the rider and then dove back into the cover of the carriage to retrieve his coat. When he turned back, the rider had disappeared into the stables. The two scholars hurried to Kiram's side. They were both typical Cadeleonians, pale-skinned and thickly built, with brown hair and eyes. One of them was older, probably in his late 40s, with shots of gray scattered through his close-cropped hair. The other scholar wasn't more than a decade past Kiram's own age, perhaps 27. He wore his hair a little long, and his cheeks were dappled with freckles. "I'm Blasio Uricon," the younger scholar introduced himself, "and this is my honored brother, Scholar Donamillo Uricon." Kiram bowed to both men. Cadeleonian names often sounded odd to him, so he made special note of their pronunciation. Many Cadeleonians found Haldiim informality rude, and so Kiram was careful to use proper titles as he addressed his new teachers. "Scholar Blasio and Scholar Donamillo, it is an honor to meet you. I'm Kiram Kir-Zaki, your humble student." Scholar Blasio smiled at Kiram's politeness. "It's a pleasure to meet you at last. Javier was just saying that he'd seen your carriage, so we came to greet you." Scholar Blasio gestured back towards the stable where the rider had been standing. He frowned at the empty spot. "I suppose he's brushing down his horse. We're short a stable hand at the moment." "It's no matter," the older brother, Scholar Donamillo, cut in. "Kiram will be formally introduced to staff and students at dinner tonight." Scholar Donamillo's tone was much more reserved than Scholar Blasio's, and his expression stern. Kiram couldn't help but think that the older man had taken a quick dislike to him, probably because he was supposed to be a gifted thinker, and he'd just fallen out of a carriage onto his face. Scholar Donamillo looked a little past Kiram to the crates stacked atop and inside the carriage. "Are all of these yours?" "Yes, sir. They're the components I fabricated for the Crown Challenge." Scholar Blasio grinned. "You brought them all the way from Anacleto? What dedication! That's fabulous." Kiram warmed to Scholar Blasio for his enthusiasm, but he also noted Scholar Donamillo's expression of disapproval. "I'll have the groundsman unpack these," Scholar Donamillo stated. I suppose that one of the tax sheds can be spared to provide a workshop for the project. No doubt it will take a great deal of space."
"Thank you, sir."
Kiram bowed again to the older man.
"I'm sorry for the inconvenience."
"Yes, it's good that you realize that this does inconvenience us. It is not common to accept a new student directly into the second-year courses, much less accommodate his individual studies." Strangely, Scholar Donamillo's stern expression seemed to soften as he looked over the wooden crates. "I can only hope that you will prove to be the mechanist genius your teachers claim you are." The label genius brought a second flush to Kiram's cheeks, and also a gnawing anxiety to the pit of his stomach. At 17, most of his achievements were still built upon his father's innovations. This would be the first time he would have to rise to a challenge alone. "I will do my utmost to win the crown challenge in the Academy's name," Kiram assured Scholar Donamillo. The older man offered him a slight smile in return. He reached out and brushed a clump of mud off Kiram's shirt. "No doubt you will want a bath after your long journey. Scholar Blasio will take you up to your room."
"Yes, sir."
Kiram snatched up his coat and his gray trunk and followed Scholar Blasio across the lush green lawn to the 3-story stone building that dominated the grounds. "This is the dormitory. First-year students are all housed on the first floor of the West Wing, and the old armory room." Scholar Blasio pointed to where the West Wing jutted out from the main building. The windows were barred. With everyone in a single room, the night wardens can keep them out of trouble more easily. Kiram was glad that he hadn't been forced to come as a first-year student. He couldn't imagine sleeping while crammed in a single room with 100 noisy Cadeleonian boys. The smell alone would have driven him mad. Second and third years are housed together on the second floor. Those young men who stand to inherit titles, of course, stay on for a fourth year of Lord's Law. They each have private rooms on the third floor.
"What about the watchtowers?"
Kiram gazed up at the 2 jutting towers that rose up from the third floor. "The west tower is used for storage, and the east one is for special cases." Scholar Blasio looked a little uncomfortable. "Let's go, shall we?" Inside, the building was dim and cool. Crests of Cadeleonian noble families, all woven in Academy blue, decorated the walls. The royal crest of the Sagrada family was inlaid in gold all over the doors. Scholar Blasio led him past a statue of a rearing stallion through a huge dining hall, and then up a massive staircase. 4 of the lecture halls are located on the first floor. The rest are in the east wing, Scholar Blasio told Kiram as they walked up the stairs. "The dining hall and common library are directly below us." "Everything seems so heavy and huge," Kiram commented. "It looks a little like a fortress." "It used to be one. 300 years ago, during the first Sagrada dynasty, this was one of their great strongholds. After the restoration, the reinstated Sagrada king turned the fortress over to one of his favored vassals to train young lords in the arts of war and law. Of course, things have changed since then, but we have not forgotten our history. In fact, it's right under our feet." Scholar Blasio paused on the stairs and pointed back down to a radiant black design that spread across the stones of the floor below them. "That is exactly the spot where 100 years ago, Javier Tornesal opened the mouth of the White Hell and defeated the Miragoth invaders." Kiram studied the fine web of black cracks. He didn't believe in the White Hell or any of the other Cadeleonian hells, but the sight of the burned, pitted stones still gave him pause. Standing in an ancient fortress with a scholar relating the story and pointing out its exact site, It seemed almost plausible that a Cadeleonian nobleman had traded his soul for the power to drive back an invading army. Even so, Kiram couldn't credit it. A soul could not be given up any more than joy or kindness could be bottled and sold at market. Only in death could the soul leave the flesh. Kiram glanced to Scholar Blasio, searching his face for some sign that he was joking, but his expression was serious. Calixto's descendants still hold the pact of the White Hell. Scholar Blasio looked meaningfully at Kiram. Kiram wasn't sure if he should respond with reverence or revulsion. At last, he decided to simply be honest. In Haldiim tradition, we don't believe that people are condemned to hells. We believe that in death, all creatures pass through a shaji and then are reborn in a new form. Seeing Scholar Blasio's furrowed brow, Kiram continued. Most modern Haldiim, like my family, don't give much credence to the tales of shaji hidden in sacred forests, or the Bahim who opened them and claimed power over life and death. If shaji ever did exist, it was in the ancient past, and they have gone now. But really, most of us understand such stories as metaphors for the balance of birth and death. Only the very religious Bahim took shajis as literal gates between life and death, and the last thing Kiram wanted was to be taken for a superstitious ascetic who'd spend hours talking to trees. Really? Scholar Blasio cocked his head slightly. So, you aren't afraid of the hells? No, as I said, we don't believe in hells. Shaji make for amusing stories, though. Scholar Blasio gazed intently at Kiram, studying his face. So, you wouldn't be afraid of a man who had been hell-branded, who had the gate to a hell burning within him? Kiram simply shrugged. I suppose not. It wouldn't worry you at all to, say, sleep in a room with him? Scholar Blasio sounded almost incredulous. So long as he wasn't insane or sick with blackpox, I wouldn't be afraid to sleep in a room with any man, Kiram replied. It wasn't entirely true. Certainly he wouldn't want to sleep in a room with a thief or murderer or, honestly, a man who stank terribly. Well, that's good to know. Your room is on the 3rd floor in the East Tower. Scholar Blasio continued up the stairs. Kiram followed him in quick strides. It's away from the other rooms, so it will be quiet enough for you to study, and unlike the other rooms, it's very spacious. Kiram thought he knew where all of this was leading, and decided to just get to the point, instead of having Scholar Blasio nervously list the amenities of his living arrangements when he'd already stated the East Tower was reserved for special cases. You want me to room with one of these hell-branded men? A descendant of the Tornesal line? You don't have much choice, Scholar Blasio admitted at last. The other upperclassmen have refused to room with a Haldiim. They have no objection to you schooling here, but sleeping in the same room when their souls are unprotected is out of the question. However, since Javier's spiritual state is already compromised, he risks nothing in sharing a room with you. Kiram wanted to demand what exactly it was that these people imagined he was going to do to them in their sleep, but then his thoughts stopped short as he registered the name Javier and remembered the dark, sardonic eyes of the rider. Javier? The man with the white stallion? Yes, Javier Tornesal, Duke of Roma. He will be your upperclassman. Chapter 2. More than spacious, the room was vast and nearly empty. 2 beds stood against opposite walls, one of them little more than a wood frame and mattress, while the other seemed well used and only half made. A dresser and writing table stood beside it, and several leather-bound books lay on the table along with an inkwell and a penknife. Normally, Kiram would have found some excuse to look through the books. This once, he wasn't paying so much attention to them. Instead, he stared at the maze of thin red-brown lines that curved and spiraled across the floor like a gigantic map of the heavens. For a brief moment, Kiram thought of Yasin Lif Harun. He wondered if it was possible that the Academy had left one of the famous astronomer's early drawings intact out of reverence. Almost at once, Kiram noted that the lines on the floor didn't match any particular constellation, and that the ink was far too fresh to have been spread across this floor a century ago. Long shafts of light poured in from the slit windows, illuminating a series of ellipses and the scrawling strange letters that they enclosed. The ink seemed to shift in color, rusty brown in some areas, deep red in others. Kiram glanced to Scholar Blasio, hoping for an explanation, but the man didn't seem to take any note of the floor. He pointed out the barren bed pushed up against the west wall. The housekeepers should have your bedding brought up before dinner, but if they don't, all you need to do is pull the bell cord just outside the door, and someone will come up directly. Scholar Blasio pulled the heavy oak door back open. You saw the bell cord, didn't you? Yes. Kiram didn't bother to look at the dark blue braided cord a second time. He frowned at the arc of letters surrounding a dark red line at the foot of his new bed. The writing was Cadeleonian, but Kiram didn't recognize a single word. The bath is through there. Scholar Blasio pointed to a narrow door just past the writing desk. In the summer, though, many of the students prefer to wash in the orchard lake. The water is quite shallow and warm. I used to go there myself when I was a student, but now that I'm an instructor, I don't go so often. It's best that instructors and students don't mix. Scholar Blasio kept his gaze away from the floor, and even the bed and desk against the east wall. He gripped the iron doorknob in one hand. Kiram realized that just standing in this room disturbed the scholar. Fifth bell will sound for dinner. It's best to come dressed formally. You have your uniform, I assume? Kiram nodded. Good, good. Scholar Blasio faded off, staring out one of the dozen tall, narrow windows. The knuckles of his hand went white as he continued to grip the doorknob. You could sleep in the stables, you know, Scholar Blasio said at last. With the animals? Kiram couldn't hide his offense at the suggestion. He wasn't some stray dog that a student had taken pity on. He had been invited by the headmaster to study at the academy. His mother had already paid a full year's tuition. No, of course not. Scholar Blasio blanched, and the freckles on his face looked suddenly very dark. It's a lovely room, really. Lots of light, and Javier says that it's quite warm in the winter. The fireplace is huge. I'm sure you'll be comfortable here. Kiram pointed to the floor, but Scholar Blasio spoke before he could get his question out. You probably want to unpack and wash up. I'll just go down and see about your bedding. With that, he slipped out of the room and pulled the door shut behind him. Kiram would have laughed at the scholar's awkward exit if it hadn't been so disconcerting. For a few moments he stood in the doorway studying the floor. He had never believed in Cadeleonian superstitions, and didn't think now was a good time to start. He boldly walked across the floor, and when he caught himself picking a careful path between the flowing lines of ink, he forced himself to step directly on the strange words, just to prove that they were meaningless. He reached his bed without incident and laid his trunk on the floor. The big white mattress looked inviting. Kiram ached to lie down and sink into it, but he and his clothes were both too filthy. He opened his trunk and found his soap tin as well as the thin white prayer clothes that his uncle had insisted he pack. Hidden beneath them, Kiram discovered a small satchel stuffed with dried mint leaves and pieces of his favorite rosewater taffy. A gift from his mother. Doubtless she'd hidden several in his things, as was her habit. A wave of homesickness overwhelmed him. He had only just arrived at the academy, and already he felt completely out of his depth.
To fear what you do not understand is to mistake ignorance for safety.
Traveling Haldiim scholars were constantly repeating that proverb. For the first time, Kiram thought he might understand why they would need to. The bathroom was little more than a closet with a large iron tub and several porcelain jars of cool water. Kiram washed quickly. When he was done, he pulled the stopper out of the base of the iron tub and listened as the water drained away. A moment later, he heard the faint sound of the water pouring out of some rain spout just outside the building. That was a clever design, Kiram decided, and he felt a little of his delight with the academy returning. He dressed in his prayer clothes. The thin cotton clung to his damp skin, but it was better than putting his dirty travel clothes back on. He left the bathroom and started for his own bed. Then one of the books on the nearby writing table caught his attention. A circle of gilded script shone from the black leather cover. Like the words scrawled across the floor, each of the curling letters looked so close to common Cadeleonian writing that Kiram thought that he ought to be able to read them. If he just glanced at the words' lengths and shapes, they seemed recognizable. Only when he looked closer did they melt into gibberish. He picked the book up and leafed through it. A deep, woody scent drifted up from the thick parchment. The last third of the book was empty, but the pages that did contain text were crammed with blocks of tightly packed, handwritten script. Every few pages there were drawings of circles and curling lines. Some looked like ornate knives, others like tangled briars or strangely skewed constellations, the very same lines that decorated the floor. 3 that resembled blades were almost under Kiram's feet. They seemed to be pointing at the other bed in the room. Javier's bed, Kiram assumed. The dark blue blankets were slightly rumpled, revealing an expanse of clean white sheets. Kiram laid the book back on the table and turned to his own bed. As he did, he realized that the door to the room stood open. Javier Tornesal leaned against the door frame, silently watching him. He was tall even for a Cadeleonian and very well dressed. The black silk suns of the Tornesal crest adorned the sleeves of his dark blue jacket. The same silk stitching ran down the length of his fitted riding pants and the seams of his leather boots and gloves. He wore a large gold signet ring on his right hand. And yet, for all his refined dress, there was still something about Javier's lean build, unkempt black hair, and hard, dark gaze that reminded Kiram of those rangy youths who haunted the smoke alleys of Anacleto and made their money with their knives. Kiram's father called them street snakes, and no Haldiim from any good family ever spoke to one of them.
I would have announced myself, but I didn't want to disturb your reading.
Javier's voice was softer than Kiram had expected, and much lower.
I wasn't...
Kiram cut himself off. It was bad enough that he'd been caught going through Javier's book. He shouldn't also try to lie to the man about it.
I know that I shouldn't have been reading your book, but I recognized the writing on the cover of the book as the same that was on the floor, and I wondered what it all meant. I'm sorry.
Javier regarded him for a moment. A slight curve spread across his sharply bowed lips.
Did you figure it out?
No, Kiram admitted. I couldn't read any of it.
Don't sound so disappointed.
Javier crossed the room to the bedside. As he passed, Kiram caught the scents of leather and sweat. He noticed tiny spears of golden straw caught in the laces of Javier's black boots. Javier picked up the book and for an instant his amused expression seemed to falter. Then the hard arrogance returned, and he tossed the book to Kiram.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?